Yves Engler, and we're going to be talking about this NaziGate in Parliament, where the House of Commons recently, during the visit of Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, they gave two unanimous or two standing ovations to a former SS soldier, Yaroslav Hunka. Now, this, despite how the media is presenting it, this to me is largely an outgrowth of Canada's both staunch support for NATO, as well as deep ties to far-right Ukrainian nationalism, long-standing historic ties. And in the media coverage so far, even though the Hunka was celebrated for his role in fighting Russia during World War II, both in the House of Commons and in the parliamentary speaker's justification afterwards, none of the media have actually looked into what the Nazis did in Russia during World War II, which was absolutely horrific. There was, 20 million or so Russians killed, incredibly brutal actions. So this incident, the NaziGate incident, has much broader foreign policy implications than is being discussed in the dominant media, and I think it may lead to somewhat of an unraveling of the unanimity of public support, or unanimity, should I say, of parliamentary support from the Greens, NDP, to the Bloc Québécois, Liberals, and Conservatives in terms of Canadian policy. We will see. There are upcoming protests in next week across Canadian cities to put pressure on the Canadian government to push for negotiations to end this proxy war. But I thought that I would invite Richard Sanders to give us some background on the NaziGate scandal, because Sanders, who a longtime leader of the coalition to oppose the arms trade, published in spring 2021 a very important historical report on this question, titled Cold War Canada, Ongoing State Support for East European émigré groups with deep fascist roots. So this is not an issue that just sort of appeared in the House of Commons a week ago. There's a long history here, and I thought I would invite Richard on to discuss the matter. Thanks a lot for coming on, Richard.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me on your show.
So Yaroslav Hunka was volunteered by his own admission for the 14th Waffen SS. He was given a double standing ovation in the House of Commons. There's images of Wayne Ears, the chief of the defense staff, the head of the Canadian military, sitting 4 seats over from Hunka, standing and clapping, and Wayne Ears has not apologized. Others, most of the MPs have apologized. Also, the Ukrainian Canadian Congress seems to have been silent. I have not been able to find any comment by the Ukrainian Canadian Congress on this issue. We know that Hunka was given an honor by the UCC apparently back in 2007. He's been donating annually to the UCC more than $5,000 over the past 6 or 7 years. We also know that Hunka had an endowment. He gave $30,000 to the Ukrainian Studies program at University of Alberta, and had an endowment under his name, which the University of Alberta has now rescinded. So this is not just some sort of random individual that, one day the parliamentary speaker just sort of, bumped into in the street and said, hey, why don't you come and I'll fet you in the House of Commons. This is somebody who clearly has roots, ties to the Ukrainian Canadian Congress and a certain element of the Ukrainian Canadian community. And so So Richard, can you give us like a bit of a background of the Ukrainian Canadian Congress, a little bit of a background on the support for East European émigré groups with deep fascist roots, as your report is titled?
Yeah. Well, I would like to do that, sure, because that's being completely ignored by the mainstream media. They're not putting this in the broader context at all. And from what I can see, the media is basically covering up this really long history of Canadian government support for not only just Ukrainian communities, that organizations that are glorifying still to this day their fascist heroes from World War II. But the government is continuing to give money for their monuments, for their community associations, for their publications, for their events, for their programs. And this is being completely ignored. It's very little known. In fact, I don't think the media has ever done really much of a story on that, on those issues. And this would be a great opportunity. I think eventually it'll come out. I think this story will broaden beyond Hunka, but at this point, at the HunkaGate, it's kind of really obscuring the broader issues. So, but one of the things that I want to point out is that when the Speaker of the House introduced Hunka, he referred to him as a hero, a Ukrainian hero, a Canadian hero, who had fought in the, quote, struggle for independence against the Russians in the Second World War. So I think that the MPs who then immediately jumped to their feet and applauded and were so happy to see this guy and to recognize him as a hero had no excuse whatsoever, because surely they must know that the Soviet Union, of which Russia was the strongest, biggest part, that it was the main foe of Hitler and the Nazis. And yeah, like maybe 20 million Russians died, but 27 million Soviets died of all nationalities. It was a really multicultural, multi-ethnic, multinational country. And this was, anathema to the fascist view of things, which was you want to have ethnic cleansing, like the Ukrainian fascists and the German fascists, the Nazis, had so much in common. The white supremacy, the hatred of communism was probably the most prominent feature of them. They hated Poles, they hated any other ethnic groups, and they wanted to wipe out. They wanted to ethnically cleanse. But so they have no excuse for jumping to their feet and applauding. And the other thing is, the speaker said the struggle for independence. Well, the Waffen SS was not struggling for Ukrainian independence in any way, shape, or form. They were a part of the Nazi war machine. They were created by the Nazi war machine, funded by them, recruited by them. The Ukrainian Catholics recruited for them as well, for the Waffen SS. But and the Ukrainian nationalists on the ground or some of them recruited for the Waffen SS. But they were not fighting for Ukrainian independence. When they joined, they were, like you said, volunteers. I think there were 80,000 of them, but many more tried to volunteer. But the Nazis picked the best 80,000. They were not struggling for Ukrainian independence. They were struggling. Their pledge of allegiance was a religious oath to fight to the death for Hitler. That's what was the wording of it. And it was religious. There was God in there. They were fighting to the death for Hitler, and this was not fighting for Ukrainian independence. In fact, the Waffen SS Galicia, this Ukrainian Waffen SS, which was part of the Nazi war machine, they were not just fighting in Ukraine. They were sent around to different places in Europe to fight for the Nazi cause that had nothing to do with Ukraine. They fought in Yugoslavia against partisans there. They fought in Slovakia against partisans there who were supporting the Soviets. So they were killing civilians and partisans, and they were doing they were under the command of Heinrich Himmler. This is not some independence movement.
Who's considered
of Ukrainians.
The architect of the Nazi Holocaust against Jews.
Yeah, Himmler was their commander-in-chief. He was the commander-in-chief of the Waffen SS coalition. And there's photos you can find online if you just Google Himmler and Waffen SS coalition. Or probably just Himmler Ukrainian will give you these photos where he's going to visit the troops. But the point is, they were not fighting for Ukrainian independence. Now, when they came to Canada, so 2,000 veterans of the Waffen SS coalition were welcomed into Canada. Canada wanted them here, even though Canada had refused the entry of Jews and was still refusing the entry of communists and did not want Jews and communists to come to Canada. They turned them away when they were trying to flee from the Nazis. But they welcomed 2,000 members of the Waffen SS coalition right after the war in the early 50s, late 40s. They also welcomed about 2,000 veterans of the Banderite army. So you have to understand that there were several different armies that the Ukrainian fascists created. There was the Waffen SS coalition that they helped to promote, and there was a split in the organization of Ukrainian nationalists in 1940. So this was the fascist movement in Ukraine, of Ukrainian nationalists, and they had a huge split, and the dominant force emerged under the leadership of Stepan Bandera. But there was another side of the split was under the leadership of a guy named Melnik. And anyway, the Melnikites, the organization of Ukrainian nationalists who were part of his side of the split, they were considered by the Nazis to be more compliant, to be more a better match for them. They used them to coordinate the entire collaboration. So the Ukrainian fascists and the were split between the two. The Nazis saw the OUNM under the Melnikites as a more reliable partner to coordinate the collaboration with the Nazis. The Banderites were considered a little bit more difficult to work with for the Nazis because they were more strident about their demand for an independent state. But the Banderites still collaborated with the Nazis at the beginning of the war. In the invasion, Operation Barbarossa, when the Nazis invaded, the Banderites helped form military units that marched in. And then as soon as they got in, then they declared independence. And this surprised and outraged the Nazis. And so for a period in the middle of the war, the Banderites sort of fell out of favor with the Nazis. But the Banderites did not even want their fellow Ukrainian fascists to join with the Waffen SS, because they wanted everybody to join their army, the Ukrainian insurgent army. Anyway, so there's all this complicated stuff. And then towards the end of the war, after the fall of after Stalingrad was liberated and the Nazis were defeated in Stalingrad, that was a turning point in the war. And the Soviet Red Army started to drive the Nazis back to Germany, and they pushed them back. And at that point, the Nazis thought, we need more support from East European fascists. We're going to give them more power. And they recruited the Ukrainian fascists under Bandera to pull together all these different fascist armies from all over Eastern Europe. There were about 20 different fascist armies that came together under the umbrella, under the leadership of the Ukrainian fascists to help the Nazis as they were retreating from the Soviet Red Army as it was driving them back and the war was ending. And then after the war, the Banderites continued to fight terrorists to strike at the Soviet Union and killed, they say they killed tens of thousands of Soviets after the war. They kept fighting after the war up until about 1960. They were still, until they were finally put down, these terrorists inside of the Soviet Union.
And
but
so
anyway,
so,
yeah, go ahead.
So Canada brings in 2,000 of the Waffen SS, a couple thousand of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, the Banderites,
the Banderite faction, yeah,
Banderight faction, and the
other military units as well, yeah. So I don't know how many, but maybe there were 5,000 veterans, fascist veterans of Ukrainian ethnic origins that were brought into Canada, plus their families. There were like several 100,000. I'm not sure, but I think it might have maybe doubled the population of Ukrainians. Now, the Ukrainians that were already in Canada that had come in previous waves of immigration were quite left-wing. They formed about a third of the Communist Party in Canada. Were Ukrainians of these earlier generations of Ukrainians. And so the Canadian government, which was really right-wing, especially Mackenzie King, my God, the guy went to Germany, met Hitler, and just wrote in his diary about how much he basically just loved Hitler. It was like he was in love with Hitler. He thought that Hitler was the best hope for promoting world peace, and he encouraged Hitler to continue. This was in 1939. He'd already been killing tens of thousands of people, 100,000 people or something. There were all these people in concentration camps. King and Hitler were both extremely anti-communist, so they saw eye to eye on that. King also went and met Mussolini. But anyway, I don't want to get distracted. The point is that all these Ukrainian fascists, former veterans, came over to Canada, were welcomed in here, and then these fascists, as well as fascists from other parts of Eastern Europe that the Canadian government really wanted to have come in, because it was the Cold War and everybody was rallying around the struggle to fight the communist threat of the Soviet Union. And basically NATO took over the role that Hitler had played. Hitler was the world's leading anti-communist, right? He was the leader of the whole international movement to destroy communism. And that's why he was supported by the bankers and the corporations and everything. Big ones, they gave him so much money. His little Nazi party was nothing in the 1920s. And then it was built up by all these bankers from the United States, from Germany, from elsewhere. So after the war, and the Nazis are a spent force. Who's going to lead the world anti-communist movement? Well, it was the United States and NATO, and NATO almost immediately brought in Germany, it brought in Italy, it brought in Spain. All these fascist governments were involved. And then once they were here in Canada, these fascists, the Ukrainians and the other ones from Eastern Europe, they started forming ethnic organizations, associations, to represent their communities. And so they formed these different, and the government funded them. And so we have the UCC, the Ukrainian Canadian Congress, which was actually created by the Canadian government in 1940. The Canadian government, because there had been this split within the fascist movement of Ukrainians, the Canadian government thought, gee, we don't want to have a split amongst these fascists. We need to bring them together to unite the fascist Ukrainians. What a thought, eh? You don't want to divide the fascists. You want to bring them together because they can be your helpers and your supporters and your allies in the struggle of the Cold War. So they united of World War II. So in 1940, the Canadian government created the Ukrainian Canadian Congress. At the same time, in 1940, over in Europe, the Nazis created another organization which had the same acronym, the UCC, but it wasn't the Ukrainian Canadian Congress, of course. It was the Ukrainian, what was it? Ukrainian Coordinating Committee. So, and it was led by the Melnikite faction, which then created the Waffen SS, and they were based in Krakow. And it was that organization, the UCC in Krakow, German-occupied Poland, that Chrystia Freeland's grandfather worked for. He worked for the UCC in Krakow, and he was the chief propagandist for that network, that coalition of fascists under the leadership of the Melnikites that the Nazis picked as their reliable partners to coordinate all the work that was done, because the Ukrainian fascists were of great help to the Nazis, of course. But anyway, I think the main thing, and I keep getting distracted by all these little details, but the main thing that I think is so important that is being ignored is that the Canadian government has been funding millions of dollars to these Ukrainian organizations in Canada that still glorify their founders, their heroes, their freedom fighters. You know, they welcomed Hitler and the Nazis as a liberating force because they were so anti-communist. Anyway, I should let you.
And no, I mean, so that gets me to another question: is that to hone in as much on the foreign policy element, because there's, you know, I think a fair bit of discussion about how these right-wing Ukrainian forces, they were brought into Canada. They then would they even blew up like a temple from a labor temple from left-wing Ukrainian, and they really worked to like undermine, divide, and you know, like actual sort of like acts of terror against left-wing Ukrainians. So that's sort of, I think, been discussed a little bit. If you can discuss a bit more about that, but I also then want on the more sort of foreign policy element, is that these far right Ukrainian and other Eastern European groups. Now, it was very obvious that pushing nationalism during the time of the USSR in Ukraine was a way to weaken the USSR. But what you see also going on even after the USSR dissolves is these forces, you know, the continued Canadian support for these forces as part of a geopolitical struggle to sort of weaken Russia. So if you can maybe mention a little bit about, you know, some of the sort of undermining of the left in Canada, but then also kind of how you see it within that kind of broader foreign policy, even post USSR kind of time.
Yeah. You're absolutely right. I mean, so why, the question is really, the underlying question is, why did Canada bring all these fascists over to Canada? And so one part of the answer to that is what you say, that and what I kind of hinted at earlier, is that the Ukrainian Canadian community in Canada before the World War II was quite left-wing. It wasn't just a little bit left-wing. You know, it had socialists and it had social democrats, but it also had a lot of communists in it. And right from the right from the Russian Revolution in 1917, the Ukrainian Canadian community was really split between these left-wing Ukrainians who were atheists, who were fighting in unions. They were involved in unions and in all sorts of progressive struggles way back, like more than 100 years ago. It's an incredible history, very interesting. And the left-wing Ukrainian community still exists, but unfortunately, it's been really overwhelmed and dominated, you know, squashed. And there were even acts of terror by the Ukrainian fascist types who came over here. They did bomb. Well, I don't think it's really been proven that they bombed that left-wing Ukrainian community center, which they called labor temples. But it's pretty clear that they must have been involved. They were probably the ones that did it. So the Canadian government brought over these right-wing Ukrainians in order to squash the Ukrainian leftist community that was already here, that was causing trouble for the Canadian government, because the Canadian government was actually quite worried back in the around the time of the Russian Revolution. They were worried about a revolution in Canada. They actually rounded up thousands of East Europeans, mostly Ukrainians, in the World War One, starting in 1914. But they kept them in prison and imprisoned in concentration camps. That's what the government called them, concentration camps. They kept these Ukrainians in these concentration camps up until 1921. Well, the World War One was over by then, but they kept them in these concentration camps where they forced them, they were just slaves. They were forced to do labor. But most of those Ukrainians were left-wing Ukrainians. Anyway, so they wanted to squat because the Canadian government was really worried, and you can see this in the correspondence between the top military and political leaders at the time. They were worried, and they were saying, we have to watch out for these guys because they might be they might cause a revolution here in Canada. So they needed to. That's on the domestic front. The purpose of this huge influx and deliberately bringing in all these really right-wing people was to squash the left-wing Ukrainian community. On the foreign policy front, as I said, earlier, hinted at, there was that it's a Cold War thing. It was so driven by anti-communism, and the Ukrainian right wing was seen as a very valuable tool, a proxy that could be used to help divide and conquer the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was the main enemy of Hitler, and it became the main enemy of NATO. So because NATO and the US-led NATO took over the role that Hitler had of being the world's leading anti-communist force. And so after World War II, they saw the Ukrainian nationalists, the far-right ones that had supported Hitler, they saw them as a useful tool for causing trouble, for destabilizing, for kind of spreading propaganda in the Soviet Union to try to bring it down. They wanted to destroy the Soviet Union. And so they used the Ukrainians as a tool.
Just jump in there, let you go further. The Royal Radio Canada International sets up like a Ukrainian section, I think 1950, to pump in sort of pro-Canada, pro-NATO, anti-USSR radio into Ukraine, and they set up other ones for other Eastern European Warsaw Pact countries as well during that. Yeah. So continue.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. The CBC International Service was complicit in a massive propaganda program to try to destabilize the Soviet Union. They were beaming in radio broadcasts there, and they same with the United States was doing the same thing, and their goal was to use the Ukrainians as a way of sort of dividing and conquering the Soviet Union, which was their main objective. Yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
So taking it up a bit more until today, sort of like Chrystia Freeland, shout out to that. Chrystia Freeland in the late 1980s, she goes there. She's clearly involved in efforts by Ukrainian nationalists to break up the Soviet Union. So that that's going on through the 1980s. But then even after USSR dissolves, these forces really become turned on Russia. Right. So to me, like, it's not just an anti-left wing and anti-communist, anti-USSR thing, and it clearly is that, but it's also kind of part of a broader historic geopolitical battle with, the Russian Empire. And Canada, in the 1850s, Canadians go fight with the British in Crimea, against Russia. Canada invades Russia in 1917. 6,000 Canadians invade Russia, and that's partly anti-communist. I think partly about World War One and partly anti-Bolshevik. But they continue to push the sort of right-wing nationalism, I think, right into today across Eastern Europe. Canada continues to push that as part of a battle with Russia that's now no longer, Russia's now oligarchic. It's no longer, socialistic. And so any, further insight into that kind of dynamic?
Yeah, something to add to that is a different way of looking at it a bit. Okay, so yeah, you're absolutely right. Russia is not a communist country. It's not a socialist country, although they have socialized medicine. They're more socialist than the U.S. They have state-owned, state-owned businesses and stuff more than the U.S. does. They're not as privatized. But the main thing, though, that I think you have to remember is two things. One, the two things would be that there is a big communist movement in Russia, even today. Like the second biggest party is the Communist Party. Can you imagine that in Canada? The Communist Party doesn't even have any MPs. Over in Russia today, they have the second largest number of members of their parliament, right? They're communists. Okay, so that's one thing to consider. So in the future, 20, 30, 40, 50 years from now, maybe that Communist Party will become the ruling party of Russia. It's possible because they're Putin's party has a super majority. Like it's really dominates the political scene there. But the communists are still big. So we have to keep that in mind. The other thing to keep in mind is that because the Russians lost so many millions of people fighting the Nazis, they were the biggest victims of the Nazis. And because they were the victors over the Nazis, they really led the destruction of the Nazis, right, in the Second World War. There's a huge part of the Russian identity that is tied up in a very pro-communist mentality because they look back on their history of having defeated the Nazis and having been the main victim of the Nazis. They see that as a very central part of their whole national identity. This is a huge part of who they are, how they think of themselves. Like you think about Canadian national identity, what are the key things that we have? Well, I don't want to go there. But, anyway, so that's important. So yeah, it's true. Russia is a capitalist country. It's more of a competitor with the United States and with NATO countries, but it has that huge history of behind it, and it still that reflects in their elections, in the sense that the communists are still a force within that country. So you have to see that Russia is a threat to the West because of those things. It's not, you can't just now separate Russia from their history and from communism. It's still a big factor in their identity and in their politics, their electoral politics.
Yeah, I see it. I mean, I agree with you that should be considered. But I see it as the U.S., any state that, whatever its social relations internally, that is a powerful state, and clearly Russia is, because it's the biggest state, and it has had a strong military. Any state that puts up any challenge to U.S. power, the U.S. is going to try to weaken. And so whether that's China, whether that's Russia, and right now U.S. has been willing to strengthen India to challenge China. But if India gets strong enough, then the U.S. will want to weaken India, because to rule the world, you obviously just don't want any competitor, especially a competitor that won't follow the orders and clearly Putin hasn't followed the orders with regards to Syria, with regards to some other Ukraine, and going back to 2014 Ukraine and others. But so yeah, so there's like a bigger picture kind of geopolitics that is driving a lot of this. But I want to thank you a lot for this very insightful background that we are not getting. We've probably in the past few days, we've seen hundreds, literally internationally. This is an international, the Parliament's NaziGate is an international leading news item. And there have been hundreds and hundreds of articles, most of them with very limited background, and you've provided some very important background. I just want to point out to people that Richard has, alongside his wonderful report that people should take a look at. It's on the website, I believe, in full. People should also sign a petition that he launched back in, I think, late 2021, titled "Stop Canadian Government Funding of Groups That Glorify Nazi Collaborators." So this was before Russia's invasion. This is not something that just began after Russia's invasion. This is something that has been understood. There's a major issue in Canadian politics. Richard has been on this issue, not just in the last 4 or 5 days, but going back multiple years. And this is some very deep research. So I do invite people to sign the petition, to check out the report. And again, thanks a lot, Richard. Thanks for coming on.
Okay, thank you.